Oh, I'm not. I'm not Jewish.
Oh, you're not.
Did you think I was Jewish?
Yes, I did.
Because of Bird.
Yes, because of Bird.
Because of Bird.
Yes.
Yeah. I've often wondered, would people
really
think that?
Yes, and you did nothing to perpetuate that, did you?
Well, no. I mean, I'm not sure what you mean.
Oh, how about on my birthday? Mazel tov, Larry.
Well, you're Jewish.
Yeah.
It's only respectful.
On the high holy days, I said, hey, you going to Templeberg? And you went, no.
Right, because I'm not Jewish, so why would I go to Temple?
Right, like I'm a Jew, but not a practicing Jew.
Oy, Larry with this.
Oi, again, see?
It's an expression.
It's an expression.
It's an expression that
what
people
is this
use.
thing? A shofar. Why is this on your desk?
People give me gifts. They'll give me like that for my desk or the mezuzah that's on the door.
What are you, by the way?
Well, I'm Swedish.
I got a Swede lawyer. She's going to get everything.
All right. So there's Larry David. We couldn't begin this. Well, actually, we usually begin obviously with our own comedy, but it just felt wrong as we contemplated a show about Jewish identity for Kion and me, a couple of goyim, to do a comedy bit about Jewish identity. So we turned it over to a master. That's, of course, Larry David, finding out that his lawyer, whom he has almost assumed is Jewish, is not Jewish, which is not necessarily germane to the conversation we're going to have, but it was funny. Or maybe it is germane. So let me just sort of try to set this up a little bit. First of all, I'll tell you who's here in the studio with me. Mark Oppenheimer writes the Beliefs column every other Saturday in the New York Times. He has the best-managed career in journalism. He's an editor-at-large for Tablet, which is a web magazine about Judaism, and he's the author of many books, including 13 in a Day, about a year spent crashing bar mitzvahs. We think it may be out of print, but you can bring it back by popular demand at the end of this show. 13 in a Day will be revived.
And I'm a Jew.
And you're a Jew.
Yeah,
absolutely.
That's my principal qualification for being here today.
Yeah, if you weren't Jewish, I don't think we would have booked you. Dan Friedman is these are people joining us by phone. Dan Friedman, the managing editor of the Jewish Daily Forward. He has also written for the New York Times, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Ali G Show, which, of course, is hosted by a Jew. And Dan's a Jew. And Dan's a Jew.
I'm a Jew, yeah.
And Marjorie Engel is with us. You'll see a pattern emerging here. Marjorie Engel is a contributing editor for Tablet. We already explained what that is. She's also working on a parenting book that looks at the Jewish mother stereotype, to be published in the spring of 2016. And so here we go.
I'm a Jew.
And she's a Jew.
She's Jew.
She's a Jew. All right. So I'm not a Jew. I'm Colin McEnroe, your host. So why are we doing this show? For a bunch of different reasons, but because we really wanted to.
Told us to.
We wanted to do a show that would kick as many tripwires as possible. No, that's not. We're doing a show to sort of explore the question. I mean, every single ethnic and religious minority that comes to America goes through some kind of curve that's pretty similar. And so one of the questions that I have as we begin the show is, what are this? On the other hand, every single story is different. So if Jewish identity is undergoing some seismic changes, and I think statistically you can pretty easily argue that it is, how specific are those changes to Jews and to Jewish identity, and how much is this basically just the curve that any ethnic or religious minority rides? That's one of my first questions, and I think the other question that I have right away is, what point on that curve are we at? So I'll just give you some numbers to give you a sense of what point on the curve we're at. A lot of these come from the Pew study. So among so-called millennials, 32% of them identify as Jews without religion.
But 32% of Jewish millennials.
Jewish millennials.
Right. It's not the case that 32% of all millennials.
I also identify as a Jew without religion. No, but that's a good point. Yeah, among Jewish millennials. So this is all and then among Jews marrying from 2005 forward. I think I'm doing this off the top of my head. I think I have it right. But from Jews marrying from 2005 forward, 58% are intermarrying, are marrying outside of Jewry. And if you look at non-Orthodox, it's 71%. These are sort of seismic kinds of numbers, Mark. I mean, these are numbers that really do kind of represent this huge change and do raise this question of, first of all, if Jewish identity is rooted in religion and family, and both of those things are changing so drastically, what does that do to Jewish identity? I mean, is that, first of all, to your mind, is that the question we're exploring here?
Sure. I mean, I think the another way to put the question is, if people aren't religiously observant and don't think it's important to follow the religious laws, which by tradition, by custom, include marrying fellow Jews and celebrating Jewish holidays in the home and things, then what is it that they're claiming when they say that they're Jews? One thing I would bracket or point out is that, of course, Orthodoxy is exploding in numbers, and so whereas after World War II, a lot of Jews correctly felt that there was some sort of crisis in whether Judaism would survive and whether Jewry would survive. That question has been answered. There will always be Jews. There will be more Jews than there are Amish. There will be more Jews probably than Episcopalians in the United States. But a lot of them, if you look 20 and 50 years down the road, will be Orthodox Jews. So the question is more, what's to become of the liberal or reform or non-practicing Jew that gave rise to Jewish humor, Jewish Hollywood, Jewish what we think of as sort of secularized Jewish culture?
So, Marjorie, then one of the questions becomes, to what degree are those qualities that Mark just enumerated, to what degree do they exist outside of a religious context and maybe even outside of a familial context? There are some who might argue, well, you don't have those two things. You don't have any kind of medium in which the qualities that Mark just talked about can grow in.
It's a good question. I mean, I think that all of us, whether we're Jewish or not, we know what Jewish humor is, and we know that, Jon Stewart, a secular Jew, who's, absence from our TV, we're all going to be mourning. That is a very specific kind of Jewish comedic rhythm. I think that sort of the American literary history is full of what we would consider, even when they're not about Judaism, this very sort of Jewish storytelling rhythms and emphasis on the family. I don't know what happens 50, 60, 70 years in the future, because even as the Orthodox population is exploding, I don't know whether that's the source. Historically, that hasn't been the source of what we think of as Jewish culture, Jewish music, which has a huge emphasis on American music. But in general, we haven't, this is going to sound horrible, but we haven't had to worry about what happens 200 years down the road, because some horrible anti-Semitic thing happens historically, and we get kicked out of a country, and then we start rebuilding, and we start thinking about what it means to be a Jew again. So who knows, maybe that'll happen.
Well, ideally not yet. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I was just going to say that actually, Marjorie, whose work I totally admire and in fact have edited any number of times, and we've been collaborators. But I think Marjorie, I don't think that's right. I don't think there's anything specifically Jewish about Jon Stewart. I think that lots of people. I think that if you looked at what Larry Wilmore's doing, or what Stephen Colbert, who's from a religious Catholic family, or what Hannibal Buress are doing, I think they're all doing American shticky humor that is not specifically anything. And of course, it was hugely influenced by Jewish comics. I mean, that was the wellspring of a lot of that style. But I think it's become broadly American now, and I don't think that as bagels have become broadly American. I think that it's very hard to point to a specifically Jewish culture outside of Jewish religious and observance practices, and the arguments that Jews have on radio shows like this, which feel very, which are very specifically Jewish. But otherwise, and I mean, of course, Dan's a comedy writer by from his infancy.
Let's save comedy for the second segment, because I feel like it's so easy to fetishize that and sort of miss a larger point. So,
but I would love to hear from Marjorie. What do you think is specifically Jewish about any aspect of culture?
Culture is a big word. But in terms of, I think that the sort of interest, American literature has often been very interested in immigrant literature, and I think that is a very Jewish thing. And I think, the values of tikkun olam, of doing mitzvot, of helping other people, these are also considered, everybody's got those values. But I think the social action thing is a big part of Judaism and Jewish practice and Jewish identity in a way that it isn't always with other kinds of religions. And in terms of the, music, I want to go. Well, let's go back to the Jon Stewart thing. I don't think Hannibal Buress and you know what? You want to save.
Well, I was going to save the comedy, but I don't want to interfere with the natural flow of conversation either.
Okay. So. I think that Larry David sticky rhythm, that's not a Hannibal Buress rhythm. That's a Jon Stewart rhythm. That's a Borscht Belty kind of thing. And I don't know, the sort of the nebbishy narrator, which I think that comes from Jewish tradition.
I want to just ask a different question slightly, which is, it seems to me, and I'll go to Dan just because I need to hear from Dan.
He's the only one with a cool accent who's on this show.
Well, one of the questions that I had as I started to prepare this show is what point are we on in the assimilation continuum, and how much tension is there around assimilation? Because that's one of the questions we're asking, right? Every ethnic minority faces this. As you move forward into assimilation, you ask yourselves a lot of questions. What do I have to keep? What do I have to leave behind? What do I want to leave behind? What do I want to keep? These are the kinds of questions. And if you look at other minorities that are in a much more problematic place right now, you can see a lot of those questions unfolding. They're unfolding right now for Muslims, for people from the Middle East in general, and for South Asians. I'm kind of on an Ayad Akhtar binge right now, and his plays are all about that. But Dan, we haven't had a Jewish president. We may have elected a Jewish vice president who didn't get to serve. I'm trying to think about like news anchors. If anybody, I don't even know any like the network news.
Barbara Walters.
Barbara Walters would be. I'm just sort of wondering how many barriers are there left. How much of the assimilation story is essentially told and settled business?
Well, I think that it's you're talking about some of the populations who are sort of maybe earlier on the assimilation curve or the acculturation curve. Mm-hmm. And there was a piece in, I think it might be in The Economist earlier this month, talking about German Americans, which we don't really think of as a separate group most of the time, and that's partly because they are Americans. What's more American than apple pie? Well, it's a German thing that they brought over, and so most things are more American than apple pie. It's an old world fruit, and so are Jews heading towards sort of the condition of German Americans? The apple pie is it's quintessentially American. Bagels are becoming quintessentially American. As an Englishman, I come over here and so much of the surrounding culture, and I think this is what Mark and Marjorie to some extent were saying, so much of the surrounding culture is deeply Jewish, and so we can have a discussion about whether Hannibal Buress is more or less Jewish than Larry Wilmore is more or less Jewish than Dave Chappelle. Like that's a great conversation to have. But when you do that conversation in England or in France, it doesn't make sense, right? And so there's some we're somewhere on that continuum, and there are certain differences between Jewish Americans and German Americans as they go along that, and of course African Americans have a whole different thing. And so the question is not whether this is a continuum or at least a flat spectrum, but how is there a three-dimensionality to this? How is the specific Jewish question played out? And I think that when you're talking about all these different questions, the immigrant question, the Jewish mother question, we were doing a piece on Jewish mothers, and we were asking the question, how is this different from Italian mothers? And really the accent's just slightly different, right? And mm-hmm. and so, but I think you have to go and Marjorie, I'm sure, will correct me on that, and there are some things to do with that. But I think you have to ask not only about those things which are specific to each different ethnicity or people, but also look at the vast differences. The Jewish American experience is not by any means a monolithic experience, nor the experience of a monolithic people. It's an extremely heterogeneous experience of many different groups of people coming over. I guess I'm a Jewish American, kind of. I've not quite got citizenship yet, but I arrived in the last 20 years.
We're pulling for you, Dan.
Yeah. Well, let me make it a religious question for a second. All right, so let's Mark just moderated a panel about the sort of a community discussion, because the Long Wharf Theater in New Haven is staging a play right now called Bad Jews, which was also played in New York. And so, and I think the necessity, as Mark correctly identified, of having a community discussion panel was the title, not actually the content of the play, which none of the people complaining about it had actually seen. But in the play, there's sort of a lot of questions about who's a good Jew, who's a bad Jew, a lot of questions about assimilation, and so I won't take an example from the play. I'll just take an example that sort of comes from life. So let's say that you are a partner in a not especially Jewish law firm, but you're Jewish, or you're chief of surgery, not at Mount Sinai Hospital, but just at any old hospital, and it's Yom Kippur. It seems to me that your decision about whether you're going to come to work that day or not is an interesting decision, and speaks volumes about where you are in that process. If you are part of that large percentage of Jews without religion, it still might bother you a little bit to go to work on Yom Kippur. On the other hand, you might be thinking, I've worked my way into this part of the world where that kind of stuff just isn't necessarily as important. I don't know. Am I asking a question that makes any sense? Yeah. Go ahead, Bart.
So I think the question you're asking is how much does the religious part of Judaism matter at all, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, if one sees it as religiously significant or religiously meaningful to stay home on important holidays, then one stays home on important holidays, right? This is only a question for people for whom they don't feel a religious imperative, whether they sense that imperative comes from God or just from tradition or just from a sense of how they want to ritualize, and sacralize parts of their life and make certain days special, the way that they're non-theistic Christians who nevertheless want to observe Christmas and Easter for reasons of tradition and custom, whatever. Right. But, if you're someone who doesn't have that relationship to Judaism at all, then it's a pretty easy question. You go to work, or you just take the day off because people will copy the day off. But
if you do that, your more radicalized is the wrong word, but more motivated cousin Daphne will scream at you, right? Will scream at you. What are you doing going to work on Yom Kippur?
There's people who are going to scream at you
no matter what you do.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
we're very good screaming people.
That's Jewish identity. We just summed it up.
But I have a friend, for example, who happens to be a brain surgeon, but which is funny in itself if you know him. But and
he's married to a rocket scientist, right?
And exactly, it's not rocket science. Right. And he says that having bacon is part of his Jewish identity because he eats bacon. He goes, my gosh, I'm Jewish and I'm eating bacon. That's it's an incredible thing for him. And so I think there's a many different things that can bring it to mind. And Mark's right to bring to say that the religious rituals are meaningful. I think two of the most important cultural inventions really of the last decade or 2 decades in American Judaism have been birthright and J-date, and those are not religious. Well, I mean, it depends how it goes for you, but they're really not religious organizations. They're purely intended to provide a context for procreation and marriage, not necessarily in that order.
We should say that Birthright, for those who don't know, offers free trips to Israel to college-aged Jews. Yeah. And J-Date helps them find spouses, although there are Gentiles on J-Date looking for Jewish spouses.
And I think Gentiles can access Birthright under certain circumstances, too.
I think you need some claim to Jewish.
I'm not sure.
I don't know.
Yes. So those are at least the stated aims. But when it comes down to it, they're both millions, if not billions, of dollars put towards making Jewish babies.
Right. And then once you have the Jewish babies, there's PJ Library, which sends out free books to basically any family that can demonstrate Judaism certainly in North America, and I think there's about 7 or 8 other countries where you just say, "Hey, I'm a Jew," and they just keep sending you children's books until your kid's 8. And
you don't have to demonstrate anything. You just go online and sign up.
So
they don't ask for a
where are your papers?
Where are your papers?
Yeah. You have to demonstrate proximity of some form to some distribution center.
Yeah, it's in certain cities. It's based in Long Meadow, by the way.
Oh, is it?
It is.
Did not know.
Yeah.
All right. We also went out. Ryan King, one of our interns, went out. We wanted to know sort of how does this play on college campuses? What kinds of conversations are had about this on college campuses? Because I think that's a kind of undulating curve too in a lot of different ways. So you're going to hear a young woman named Danielle Shalou, who was interviewed by Ryan King on the UConn campus. Wolfie, we're going to play cut number 1 from Danielle.
So the thing that I think is the beautiful thing about the Jewish religion is that it's both a religion and it's not, and then it's a people and it's not. And it's this combination of the culture part and the religion part and the belief in the God part. But I think at its core, Judaism is really this set of beliefs that is shared by all these disparate people from all these disparate groups. My personal opinion is that Judaism can be whatever you want it to be. I went to a service once with humanist Jews who believe just that there is no God. but there's still the whole thousands of years of tradition and culture behind it. For me, my God is who I want my God to be, and it may not align with what the standard teaching is, but that's between me and my God.
So, Mark Oppenheimer, there are rabbis tearing their hair out right now, right? Because I mean, there's a profoundly American statement and probably a profoundly millennial statement too. That I can pretty much, this can be a very bespoke interaction that I have with my religion and my heritage.
There is a very rich tradition in Judaism of quarreling over whether this is, I wouldn't say culture, but what some people will say. I mean, Mordecai Kaplan, the founder of the Reconstructionist school of thought in Judaism, said it's a civilization. That was his term. It's a people. So, and one of the things this people has done is create holy books, but they've done other things, and those other things matter for a sense of cohesion as well. I mean, I think that very articulate woman was describing the way a lot of Jews in America and elsewhere feel, not least in Israel, where there are millions of non-observant, totally atheistic Jews alongside some very Orthodox ones. My question is always, I think when we try to put a finer point on what that culture is, we always end up talking in just ridiculous stereotypes that endure for at most a generation or two, right? So the Larry David shticky stuff, or specific kinds of Jewish cuisine, or even the stereotype of the Jewish American princess, which has nearly disappeared, or the Jewish mother, which has a little bit more endurance. Those are 2 or 3 generation phenomena that don't really have much heft to them. And so they're not really going to carry on 3 generations down the road. If that's what your great-grandchildren have as their Judaism is like the 1968 version of what a Jewish mother was, then it's a pretty thin culture.
Right. Well, yeah. Dan, before you go, I just want to throw that at Marjorie for a second, too, because it seems to me, I don't know, a few years ago, I was at the bar mitzvah of a young man, a friend of my son's, and I had a Goyim epiphany about Judaism. I mean, I was just sort of sitting there, and certainly not my first bar mitzvah by any stretch of the imagination, but I suddenly thought, wow, a group of people have decided that these things which have existed for thousands of years, these words, these ideas, these practices, they are going to survive. They don't, no matter what happens to us, this is going to survive. We're going to do this. We're going to keep doing this, and the next generation is going to do this, and the next generation is going to do this. And I really had this very powerful moment that had nothing to do with my own heritage or birthright.
Your own lapsed Catholicism.
My own lapsed everything. But I just sort of thought, this is kind of amazing. And in a way, as much as Judaism is a lot like other cultures and other religions, I almost couldn't think of quite a parallel that's exactly like this, that's as powerful and persistent and I think as intentional. And in a way, that's the thing that sits over all that very temporally confined stuff that Mark was just talking about.
That was very eloquent, Colin. I agree with you. And as you were talking, I was thinking about I went to an Orthodox Jewish day school until 8th grade, and then I went to public school. My kids are solely public school educated, but they go to Jewish camp. And when I picked up my daughter at Jewish camp, she was singing to me a song that she had learned at camp. She's not fluent in Hebrew, but it was a Hebrew song, and it was one that I had not heard since I was 12, and I had tears come to my eyes because even though it had no religious meaning to me, but somehow music is this real common denominator, and this notion that probably my parents knew that song, and maybe Josie's children will know that song. My husband has family in Brazil, and that's the same melodies, and that there's something really powerful about that.
Dan, I know you had a response that you were going to make, but I'm going to fire a question at you, and you can combine it into the response you were going to make, too. Which, one of the other reactions that I was having to that young lady speaking on the UConn campus was that as I see these things play out from my position on the sidelines, but, even in the Play Bad Jews that Mark was just moderating the panel about, the question comes up time and again, well, it isn't really just about you, right? It isn't about you and what you decide and what you pick as you pass through the smorgasbord line, what you decide to dish up onto your plate. I mean, there is an entire culture out there, and there's a set of obligations, and there's, things that happen generations before you. So who are you to say, well, I think I'll keep this one and drop that one? And to me, that's another one of the questions for any ethnic minority, but maybe Jews more than most people.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that everyone, I think what you're describing is the millennial generation, whether that's Jewish or not Jewish. It's the people who, don't remember music or film or books in solid form, and I was a teacher for a long time before I was a journalist, and you kind of learn to trust the next generation that they're going to do it their way, but they'll do it. And so you have to, so what I was going to butt in and say, and this is how it joins together, is that, your goyish revelation at the bar mitzvah was there's an intentionality and there's a really clear way that you pass stuff on from generation to generation through religion. Now, culture is always going to be more amorphous than that, and you hope that it's going to pass on. Obviously, as Jews have taken different routes through the world, they've accreted different types of cultural norms, different philosophies, different foods. I mean, the bagel is now a quintessential Jewish thing, and as a challah, but they're just Eastern European breads, that have been used by the Jews, and and Jewish philosophy is deeply influenced by Arab philosophy of the early part of the second millennium, and so you've got these continual absorptions and acculturations of different cultures that go around, and and obviously religion tends to be a little bit more conservative, but and Mark may know the dates of this. I think the bar mitzvah ceremonies as a rite and as a ritual of passage are only like a couple of centuries old. That it feels ancient, but it's a response to modernity. And I think, that we're going through a different stage of modernity. And, it's very worrying to people who are committed to a certain small c conservative sense of religion and culture to see people take these smorgasbord. But, the young people, next generation, the generation after that, they're going to do it their way. And if they understand what's important and why it's important and what the responsibilities that go hand in hand with the rights and the beauty and, how you make people cry and make people laugh, they'll do it their way. I don't know what that's going to be because, but my daughters will do, and their children behind them.
We have to take a break right now or I'll be in so much trouble. I'm in trouble anyway. And I do want to say we're going to end with another clip from Danielle Chalou, particularly out of fairness to her. I've picked on millennials so much on this show that I'm amazed there's not a class action suit filed against me. But in fact, many of the things that we're just saying right now you'll hear here in this quote from Danielle.
At my bat mitzvah, there's a ceremony you do. So I'm up there and I'm 13, and then my parents are there, and then my grandparents were there. And there's a whole ceremony where you pass the Torah down, and it's very symbolic. And the rabbi's talking about, it's come down all this way from Mount Sinai, and it's been passed through all the generations. And here you are, and you're ready to receive it and take its teachings into your heart. And then, you look to the other side, and he makes, and you're 13, and you're just standing there thinking, oh, my God, I hope I don't forget the prayers, and what am I going to say in my speech, and, am I standing up straight enough for my mom, and all those things. And then gestures to the generations in front of you, and it's also just as important to teach them. And I don't know if at that moment it really struck me of, oh, yes, well, I need my children to be Jewish. But I think it did make an impression of, I can't really be the end.
You think a man his age should get married? They only met 6 months ago.
It depends. If she's a nice girl, why not?
She's nice, but why do they have to rush in? He's still paying alimony.
Mother, stop. Let them lead their own lives.
I have the same problem with my daughter. They grow up and they think they have all the answers.
How old is your daughter?
26.
You got any pictures?
Home.
Home? I always carry Sheldon around wherever I go.
Oh, God, this can't be happening.
Here he is. 2 years
I need
old.
oxygen.
And
I got to get out in the fresh air. I need cyanide.
You can't show pictures. And isn't he a darling?
That, of course, is Woody Allen. All right, so we are talking about Jewish identity. Now we can come sort of to comedy. Although, Marjorie Engel, I want to begin with something that sort of both is and isn't a comedy because it's I'm finding that the show Transparent, available on Amazon, which Mark says you've written about recently, in terms of running its thumb down the knife's edge between what's comedy and serious, what's comic and serious about the whole question of Jewish identity. To me, it's as interesting a show about Jewish identity as it is about sexual identity or gender identity, or I've gotten a lot of trouble recently for confusing those two terms. And so you have this Jewish family living in Los Angeles and exploring a lot of questions like this. It turns out that one of the three young adult daughters, one of three young adult children in the family didn't have a bat mitzvah because she was being a rebellious, spoiled little brat, and also because her father found it very easy to cave on this because he really wanted to go and to some cross-dressing summer camp experience that nobody knew he was having. But there's a rabbi who's brought in as an amorous partner to one of the other siblings, and there's one moment where I can't remember what thing they're doing, but they're doing some kind of observance, and I think the rabbi is going to be present at it. And the third sibling, Shelley, as they're walking in, says, "What are we, a religious Jewish family now?" And to me, what I got at that moment is that maybe one of the mistakes we make in conversations like this is assuming that anybody dealing with any kind of identity kind of sets their throttle at something and leaves it there, that it's at 60J and then it just stays there for the rest of your life.
J is the unit of Jewiness.
and that really, our whole
Colin
lives.
McEnroe just coined a unit of Jewiness. Put that out there on Twitter.
Determined to get me tweets.
60J.
Okay, WNPR Colin, you can tweet about that. So, but you know what I'm saying? That in fact, our whole lives, no matter what we are, we're throttling up and down.
And I thought it was interesting that Transparent, you have this incredibly nuanced portrait of where Judaism is right now. Mm-hmm. And this is a show that is, that it's not just Jews who are watching. And then you have, the jumping off point for the piece was about the death of the actress who played Mrs. Wolowitz on The Big Bang Theory, which is classic sitcom, the stereotype of the Jewish mother, just shrieking and wearing a house coat and smothering her kid. And the only thing she was interested in is whether her kid was dating outside the faith or not, and, guilting him. And then you have this beautiful, thoughtful portrayal. And it's not fair to compare a network sitcom to, Amazon's whatever experiment that is. But, I think that there's, it's easy to be really reductive when you talk about Judaism in general. But remember that Judaism has always been this very dialogic faith, that the whole Talmud is basically people saying, people just arguing with each other about what it means to be Jewish. And I think that comes from a very legit place.
And I think, Mark, also that it really explores the push and pull of secular life and secular transition against religious life and religious transition and ethnic transition, too. So Dad really wants to go to this summer camp where he and Bradley Whitford from the West Wing can dress up as women. And right. So he doesn't put up the kind of fight that he would about Ali having her bat mitzvah. But then years later, it's really this stain. It comes back as this huge stain.
I mean, one of the things I see as a journalist talking to religious people of all faiths all the time is that Americans – I mean, this is the land where you don't have to be anything, right? You don't – but if you're not anything, you are by default something, which is either – and the two somethings I think you can be – and these are gross generalizations, right? These are reductive stereotypes of both – is you can either be like the red state Walmart shopper or you can be the blue state NPR listener. And both of those are particular forms of consumerism where you're letting the choices of what you buy and consume and listen to and where you set your radio and where you take out your credit card determine your identity, right? Most people at various points in their life want to transcend that a bit, and they want to think of themselves as not just sort of consumerist Americans who maybe have an obligation to vote but not much else. They want to think of themselves as Roman Catholics or Jews, or maybe they want to think of themselves as people who are in some sort of deep service to other people, or maybe they want to think of themselves as artists. But people look for ways to transcend that existence that otherwise America just hands us through advertising and consumption. And I think that what was so interesting about Transparent is the pull for the Jeffrey Tambor character, and I always think it's funny that Tambor for a bit dabbled with Scientology about 10 years ago. But the pull for the Jeffrey Tambor character –
there's the dirty religious laundry of every celebrity in America.
Every celebrity. But the pull for the Jeffrey Tambor character is not between Judaism and, shopping. It's between Judaism and giving over some part of himself to his gender identity.
Right. Something very, very profound.
Very profound. And what's amazing is then he merges them. I mean, then he's like saying he's living as a woman in episode 5 or 6, and she's the one who remembers the proper melody of the Shabbos prayers. Mm-hmm. So they become nicely – there's no reason those have to be in tension at all.
Just to sort of go to another part of that cultural continuum, Dan Friedman, I think one of the other things that we know is that increasingly over the last 20 to 30 years, American popular culture, we did a show about sitcoms recently, which I was making the point that really from the beginning of sitcoms, what happened was there was sort of spillover from Borscht Belt and vaudeville. And so, very early on, our television idea of comedy was really, really dominated by a Jewish comic aesthetic and kind of has stayed that way. It may have morphed and it's it's different now, but and Seinfeld is certainly different from Jack Benny, but it stayed that way. And you can sort of add to that now that the other dominating cultural aesthetic probably of the last 30 to 40 years has been black in music, in sports, in fashion, and just name it. African Americans now really are set another trend, and with each, I wonder if there isn't kind of an interesting tension, and it's kind of the tension that does come up in that Seinfeld episode where Bryan Cranston, as the dentist who wants to be part of something that he really has no business being part of, but he wants to be included in something that he can't really be included in. And it seems to me one of the interesting paradoxes of modern Jewish identity is that it has become very, very attractive. It has a much bigger influence than 2.2% of any population would typically have. And so you have a lot of people who kind of want to get in on it without really paying the price of admission in any particular way.
Yeah. No, we just had a piece in the paper this week by our columnist Alyssa Strauss talking about, I think the title is called Tom Brady's Menorah, because he's got one of those, and why not? And he could easily pay the price of admission, but although if the price of admission is a bris, so a ritual circumcision, maybe he couldn't pay that anymore. But and of course Cameron Diaz and Benji Madden had a chuppah at their wedding recently, and so you've got this sort of place where Judaism seems to have a certain way of providing appealing rituals and ritual objects that are trappings of a certain type of upper middle class lifestyle, but have meaning to them. I think this is what Mark was saying as well. That in terms of the Tambor character, he's not searching between two things that are meaningless. He's escaping his meaningless things, and he's caught between two things of meaning that maybe don't have valency for him at that exact moment. And I think that's that Judaism is one of those things that's in the popular culture that has these rituals that provide meaning and ritual to, in a beautiful way, to daily life. So that the intentionality of putting a chuppah up and explaining what that's about. So the canopy above the bride and the groom at the wedding. I think that's a beautiful thing. And why shouldn't other people take that? That Judaism, as I said, has taken a lot of these rituals from elsewhere. There's a Christuza or a Christuza, which is like a mezuzah, the small scrolls that are put in normally a metal holder on the doorpost of a Jewish house. Some entrepreneurial Christian guy has turned a Christuza, which has got Christian scrolls inside this that he's encouraging Christians to put on their doorposts. I think this is it's a way. I think there's a dearth of meaningful experiences in 21st century consumer culture, and I think that Jews, because we've been fighting or discussing or being told what we should do for a long time and disagreeing with that, have got a good way of dealing with that. And there's a bunch of people out there who want to find meaning, and so I think although I joke about the price of admission, I think that's not really the question. Good luck to Tom and good luck to Cameron. If they like our stuff, then by all means do their version of it. It's a question for people inside to think about how what's meaningful to them and how they pass that on to friends, family, and down the generations.
All right,
one thing that's
go ahead,
really
Marjorie.
nice, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say one thing that's really nice about Jewish ritual is that so much of it is home-based ritual. Mm-hmm. So if you're anxious about a synagogue or it brings up too many icky God questions for you, lighting candles at home, there's something beautiful always about candlelight anyway, doing a blessing over wine, breaking bread together. There's a reason that I think that there's this sort of fetishization of Shabbat and the idea of taking a computer-free day, a technology-free day. Making hamantashen. These are all things you do in your house that don't have to bring up uncomfortable questions about God, but make you feel a sense of identity and belonging and connection to the past.
Right, and sorry, just to take up on that you don't need you don't need a rabbi for either marriage or circumcision ceremonies and most other things. And even if you do have a rabbi in both of those situations, you probably don't need to have God. And there's one of the great things I think about the Jewish tradition is that is what Margie was talking about before, that it's an ongoing human interaction and interpretation of what it is to be Jewish and to have an ethical and religious take on the world around us and the people around us.
We're going to just grab a quick break here. We also, Ryan King, our intern, also talked to Levi Alpert on the pathways of the UConn campus. We'll end this segment with clip 2 from Levi.
I think we have such an interesting history. The whole idea of being spread out wherever these people were, they were sort of outsiders. I mean, constantly getting kicked out from place to place, notably, Spain and the Inquisition. I guess we don't think of Spain as having a thriving Jewish or Muslim population, but they really did a number on those people. That long history of wandering people, I guess, strengthens the cultural side of it, a sense of camaraderie wherever these people are. An example with, American immigration, early 1900s, late 1800s, with Italians and Irish and Jewish people. They all would kind of have their own neighborhoods, have their own areas, and I guess the Jews were always unique in that they didn't have a specific country they came from, but they all had the religion.
Today's show was produced by Betsy Kaplan and me, Kyone Wolf. Our interns are Kelsey Bissell and Julia Pastel. Thanks to Ryan King for collecting audio for this show. Greg Hill tweets for us at WNPR Colin, and the part of Bill Curry was played by Joe Lieberman. For show pages, articles, and videos of the Faith Middleton Show staff... No, never mind. We're not going there. On tomorrow's show, The Nose talks about letting go of Jon Stewart. And now, back to Colin.
Yeah, Marjorie may have to come back tomorrow for our conversation about Jon Stewart.
Cry.
So we do have to talk just a little bit about the relationship between Jewish identity and Israel. And I can make it as fresh as today's headlines. So Netanyahu, as everybody knows, has been invited to speak to Congress, but invited by Republicans in what amounts to kind of a breach of protocol. So our own senator here, Dick Blumenthal, this week is struggling over whether or not to attend. And he says, well, I'm here as a senator from Connecticut, and I have to make a decision about what serves the national interest. And obviously I am Jewish, so I will be inclined to go. But I, have to make a decision on what I think is the right thing to do. So, Mark Oppenheimer, worlds are contained in that statement. But,
right, I mean, the worlds contained in that statement is the age-old, criticism of Jews, or the fear that Jews are actually beholden to a foreign power, right? So one of the things going on in his mind is, if I say I'm going because I'm Jewish, oh, whoops, I just said it, then will the anti-Semites say, well, of course, he's first and foremost a citizen of world, Jewry, and hence, of course, he would go. But then, of course, there's the fear that if he doesn't go, that a lot of Jewish contributors and voters will actually be upset because they do expect him to go, because they do have a special affection for Israel. And then, of course, there's the fact that he's not a deeply ethnically committed or religiously committed Jew, from what I can tell. I mean, he may have been the most religiously committed Jew on the Harvard College swim team in his year, but otherwise, he's not like the Jewiest of senators.
He didn't butterfly on Shabbos. He did.
So I just think, the poor man, that was not the question he wanted to be hit with.
Yeah, to me, this is such an interesting question, and so I don't know how well either of our other two guests connect to this particular topic, but I'm sure there's some other version of it. So we had this case that Mark covered a lot of this Episcopalian chaplain at Yale who said, this kind of untoward thing about anti-Semitism in Europe, and basically said, well, it's to some degree or other fueled by Israel's own behavior. And I don't know, Mark, he went a little further than that and said
essentially this was Bruce Shipman. Yeah. And I'm sure that Margie and Dan both read about this and followed it. That and Dan had to publish on it at the forward. He seemed to be saying, let's one thing we have to take into account when Jews are murdered is the behavior of Israel, which I said was, a little bit like if blacks are, murdered by police, do we say we have to take into account the behavior of Ghana or Nigeria? It's just, but to Shipman, that was entirely intuitive. So I don't know. It does always kind of lurk because, Jews have a theological commitment to this sort of ancestral land, as Muslims and Christians also have theological commitments to ancestral lands.
So Mark and I agree about almost everything, and we enjoy each other's company a lot. I would say say the sweater he wore to the forum he just moderated in New Haven might be one of the breaking points for us. But I saw this lengthy interview that you did with Shipman, in which he tried to explain his position a lot more. And so, to my eyes, I'm getting to a point here, I promise. To my eyes, as I was reading this, I was thinking, well, he's kind of explaining himself, and I would imagine that he's getting, this is in Tablet, and I would imagine he's getting some of the people who are mad at him back. And then I started to read the comments
yeah.
and people were madder than ever.
Yeah.
And I thought, there's a disconnect here, because I saw it one way. And Jews who read Tablet reading that piece saw it another way. They were more offended than ever. And I do think this might be an interesting area of Jewish identity where, one community still doesn't get or understand the other community that well. So, Dan, react to that.
Well, I think there is a split here between. There's a complicated connection between Jews in Israel. So there's a theological connection. There's a peoplehood connection. The Birthright is trying to help join up, and also just there's a legal connection. So that Israel has got a right of return, which says that every Jew that's born in the world has an in potentia citizenship, and that's intended to provide any Jews that are in trouble around the world with a homeland, and there is only one Jewish state, and so that's the argument against the Ghana thing. That there are a number of different places that African Americans came or were forced to come from in Africa to America. So on the one hand, there's a complicated and multivalent connection between Jews around the world and Israel, and on the other hand, there's and in America, there's a political component to that as well that we see borne out, that most Jews, the vast majority of Jews are liberal-leaning and are probably largely, that they supported Obama, probably would not support Netanyahu, certainly insofar as he's not helping the peace process along. And so between those so there's a disjunction between the political views of a particular regime and practice in the Jewish community and what, and then this sense of heart and religious belonging and connection to Israel on the other side. And I think that what we see is the people who are Israel can do no wrong on the one hand, and on the other hand, I feel very strongly about this, but Israel has clearly done something wrong. This regime, this particular army officer, this particular action, something has gone wrong. And so you see that butting up against each other in the forward comments, in the Tablet comments, in the Times of Israel comments, and that's so that is a rift, and it tends to play along other divisions, which are religious divisions.
Dan, I want to make sure we're just about out of time. I want to just let Marjorie have 60 seconds on this anyway, which is like what I can give you. So do with them whatever you want.
It took me 7 years of being a columnist before I even wrote about Israel because it freaked me out so badly. And when I ended up sending my kids to a Zionist camp, I couldn't believe myself. And I get accused by the left and by the right, which I assume all three of us do, of,
sure.
We're the worst thing for the Jews, we're the best thing for the Jews. But I think being ambivalent about Israel is very much an American privilege and a right, and a lot of us feel that way.
All right, we're going to have to stop and just, first of all, thank everybody. This conversation flew by. I mean, this really flew by. You guys are all so great. Marjorie Engel, contributing editors for Tablet Magazine, working on a parenting book that looks at the Jewish mother stereotype. We can't wait. That's the spring of 2016. Dan Friedman is the managing editor of the Jewish Daily Forward, also written for the Ali G Show. No, that's diversity right there, those two things. Mark Oppenheimer, of course, writes the Beliefs column every other Saturday for the New York Times. We are pulling back from obscurity one of his many books, 13 in a Day, about a year spent crashing bar mitzvahs.